This is the InfoSec and Notes Show, episode 77. I'm your host, Josh Amishav. Today, we're joined by Nate Warfield. Ever wonder how some security researchers come across the most amazing findings, like water purification admin interfaces connected to the internet? Today, we're going to chat about some advanced techniques that you can use when conducting internet-wide searches, as well as some ways you can use those skills to help protect some of our most critical infrastructure, like hospitals and medical facilities. My three main takeaways from a conversation were: one, how to use tags to easily search Showdown for systems vulnerable to specific CVEs; two, the most common threats the medical sector faces; and three, a couple of interesting techniques he uses to collect threat intel. You'll enjoy those few things, plus a bunch of other nuggets along the way. Direct support of this podcast comes from BreachSense, the data breach monitoring platform. More details can be found at breachsense.io. And now, here's my conversation with Nate. Nate Warfield, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Josh.
All right, so who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, I'm, like I said, Nate Warfield. I am the Chief Technology Officer for Prevaileon, which is a Houston-based threat intelligence infosec company. We specialize in technology that detects third-party risk and supply chain attacks.
Awesome. So recently, I think it was about a week ago, we had a local hospital here that was hit with ransomware and they had to cancel all non-emergency procedures. How is it that after all these years, we're still not getting better at security?
Well, it's tricky, right? The ransomware problem seems to be forefront in most people's minds these days. And it's really just an extension of the same problems that we've seen with information security for years, right? We have people whose job may be to open PDFs and process, in this case maybe it's medical claims or billing information, and they're busy, so they inevitably somebody's going to accidentally open the wrong document. The C2 connection will be made. The real problem is that unlike some of the previous things where people were just interested in stealing information, now they're interested in both stealing it and then ransomwaring it and holding the business hostage.
So, how can hospitals and medical facilities protect themselves?
Well, I wish there was a simple answer, but really, it's a lot of the same stuff we say, right? They need to be keeping up on their patching. I would suggest having some user training on things that some of the warning signs that we see, right? Like documents, invoices that are coming through with a weird sense of urgency or threatening, or anytime that there's something that just kind of feels off. Maybe you have a little bit more caution about it. Of course, there's the external attack surface thing that we saw, especially last year with remote working and people doing VPN a lot. They buy these black box solutions that do VPN and maybe a bunch of other things, and when these devices end up having a vulnerability, they are very complex to patch at times, right? If you have a lot of people working remotely, it's hard to take them down and patch them expediently or expeditiously, I should say. But it is something that they just need to be aware of. Things like the Exchange vulnerability from this year. These are mission critical systems, which it's difficult to explain to upper management why it needs to go offline for a few hours. But I guarantee you that doing that is far better than the alternative of being compromised or ransomware through it.
Do you think going through the cloud or having a lot of cloud-based services would have reduced a lot of the risk?
Yes and no, depending on how you're running in the cloud, which cloud, if you're running like, IaaS or PaaS or SaaS, you get different levels of sort of patching that's handled by the vendor. My experience was specifically with Microsoft when I was there. And I believe it was the SaaS solutions and PaaS solutions where some of the better.
What can you just go through? What are
Oh,
those?
yeah. So
What are they?
IaaS is infrastructure as a service, which is basically it's sort of like having your own bare metal server in your data center. You're responsible for installing the operating system, for patching it, for doing all of the normal stuff that we are used to doing with, a data center that we controlled. PaaS is more platform as a service, which is it's a bit abstracted. You're not having to manage the operating system directly, but you're maybe getting SQL Server or IIS, and these are things that generally are patched by the vendor to a degree. And then SaaS is software as a service, where um, you've got basically an entire package where you say, okay, I want to deploy this web application thing, and there might be SQL and IIS and different solutions behind it. But the whole solution is managed by the vendor. You just upload your stuff into it. So those ones The SaaS and the PaaS stuff, a lot of times the vendors can patch the underlying systems for you, and it's less complex than having to run Windows Update every month, so to speak. But I don't know that a cloud deployment is a it's not really a silver bullet for security. As we've seen, it is complex, especially if you have old guys like me that are used to the traditional network server security. It can be a bit of a stretch for them to understand. There's a lot of different access permissions, and we see we've seen S3 bucket problems. We saw the issues at Capital One where they a minor permission problem allowed somebody to access tons of financial data. So there's always there is a bonus to having some level of the vendor managing it, but there's also added complexity that cloud is relatively new for most people.
Yeah, and you definitely see at least weekly, if not more often, the open S3 buckets or Elasticsearch servers that are just rampant and full of PII.
Yeah, yeah. It seems like not a week or a month goes by that we don't see somebody with tons of records that are exposed, and this problem's not new. This has been going back 4, 5, 6 years.
Yeah, so let's go back to talk a bit about like the medical care facility. So you're what is CTI, and then that kind of goes back to helping protect those places.
Sure. So CTI League is something that myself and three other gentlemen started back in March of 2020. I basically I had just gotten back from a conference in Israel where I talked about using tools like Showdown and Gray Noise to assess your perimeter, your network's perimeter. And I was specifically drilling into a Citrix vulnerability. So about a month later, before we all got sent home, I was working through whatever I was doing, and I saw a note about a Czech hospital, or a hospital in the Czech Republic, I should say, that was ransomware. And it kind of got me thinking. So I, did some Shodan foo and found a bunch of vulnerable Citrix devices, started cross-referencing and looking for just, or seeing if they're running on networks that had like health, hospital, medical, anything in the network name. And I actually came across two devices that were running on the medical group that I go to personally. So I kind of putting something out on Twitter. One of the gentlemen, Ohad Zeidenberg, out in Israel, who I'd met, he pinged me and said, "Hey, do you want to help me start a group?" I said yes. We looped in Mark Rogers and another guy, Chris Mills, and within a month, we had built in Slack about a 1,500 person sort of volunteer pro bono infosec team. Our goal was just to give as much free threat intelligence and sort of perimeter assessments to healthcare and hospital networks. And we ended up getting law enforcement from a lot of U.S. law enforcement, FBI, Homeland Security. We had Health and Human Services, CISA. We had people from Interpol, from Europol. We even had a gentleman that did cybercrime work out in the Faroe Islands. So we had a good global presence. We gave a lot of good information out to people to help just get them ahead of the ransomware problem.
Are the hospitals capable of consuming the threat intel that you provide them? Meaning, in terms of like having
It's
these
tricky.
skills.
Yeah. So one of the thing I know that one of my actual a friend of mine knew the hospital administrators at my own hospital, and he just reached out directly, and they were able to patch their devices within a day or two. The interesting part of that, one of the things we learned is, and this is going to factor into why I'm going to say I don't really know if they're able to process it very well. We were never able to do it didn't work for us to sort of reach out directly to hospitals, networks, and administrators. It turns out when you kind of out of the blue say, "Hey, I have some intelligence about your network perimeter," people aren't quite as receptive to that as you might think. So what we ended up doing was partnering with in the U.S. they're called ISACs, ISAC, which is just working groups of people in the same industry. And by leveraging those partnerships, we could say, our group would say, "Hey, we found exposed RDP servers, or we found RDP credentials for this network that are being sold on the dark web." We could just hand that information over to our ISAC partners. They could give it to the hospital, so it was coming from a trusted source. But one of the things we learned kind of as organically through this process, we wouldn't really hear anything back from them, right? We would sort of get a thank you from the ISAC member. The hospital may or may not have actioned on it, but they weren't exactly forthcoming with telling us, "Hey, thank you, we fixed the problem."
So then, how do you keep tabs in it? How or do you just move on? How does that work?
We would do some rescanning. We did see, at least with some of the the easier stuff, like say for example, open VPNs that were needing to be patched, we could run that through Showdown again and say, okay, we've noticed that the numbers decreased. A lot of these hospitals have obviously patched. For some of the other things, like for example, stolen RDP credentials, because we were sort of a do no harm, we wouldn't touch the networks. We wouldn't even validate whether the credentials were real, right? That would be illegal to log in and see. So we would kind of give them the information. It would go out into the void, and we would cross our fingers and hope that they'd taken some action on it.
What are the most common threats that you deal with in CTI League?
The most common threats we dealt with were definitely overexposed perimeters, overexposed unpatched systems. There was an Exchange issue that came out in 2020 that I think we found there was like 20 or 30,000 hospitals that we believe were affected. There was the RDP credentials being stolen and sold, and that was really all we could see from where we looked. Right, we weren't able to assess from inside their perimeter. We didn't have well, many of us worked for security vendors. Due to our non-disclosure agreements, it wasn't like we could go and say, oh yeah, we see their EDR client is picking this up or it's not picking up things. So really, we could only look from the outside toward sort of in.
Cool. So, let's talk about some of the techniques you use to collect the threat intel.
Yeah, so I've kind of done a lot of talks or a few conference talks about Showdown, which is one of my favorite tools. Really, what I would do, initially, and I kind of had the advantage at the time because I had an enterprise access account. And so I was able to use one of the search tags in Showdown, which is vuln colon. And so Showdown it'll test some of the vulnerabilities that it can do in a non-invasive fashion. So in this case, the Citrix vulnerability was one of the ones that it was able to detect without sending any malicious payloads. So I could just put in vuln and like CVE 2019, I think it was like 1978-9 or one of those numbers. And I was able just to download a list of all the machines in the world that Showdown had detected as vulnerable. And then from there, I would parse out that information. It was downloading in JSON. I would, parse through it and dump out a text file of, just the IPs, the organizations, and like the autonomous systems, and whatever information that was in there. And then I was literally using grep with a long string of keywords to find that stuff. For
Based on the
organization,
domain name?
I was honestly just I was grepping for like health, hospital, medical, doctor, nurse, any keyword that might like show up in the organization or the autonomous system number if it was registered to a large hospital. So I was just looking for just sort of a shotgun approach of anything that looked like it was running on a hospital network. I would go and grab.
Okay, cool. And then besides for the tags, if somebody doesn't have a license, are there techniques they can use if they want to search for their own organization? Some other Shodan keywords that work well.
Yeah, absolutely. You can do an organization search. So if you know the organization name, I personally, being an old network engineer, I like using autonomous system numbers because it gives me a large list. If they have multiple IP blocks that have been assigned, the autonomous system search will get you
So,
everything.
yeah, that works well for large organization. I guess for smaller
Yeah,
organizations, then you
for a
probably have to be a little bit more clever about it.
Yeah, for a small organization, it comes down to understanding what IP ranges they're running on the internet in. So if you're an organization that you have maybe like a small slash 27 or a slash some small network, you can plug in it's a net colon search, and so you can actually just search a specific subnet on the internet against Showdown, and it'll show you everything you have exposed. Usually those small networks are easy to kind of parse through in the web UI. You can just kind of click through a few pages and make sure that there's nothing like printers or PBX systems. I found Polycom systems open to the internet before. There's some of the medical record. We found a couple medical record systems that were open there. So it's understanding as a network administrator where your perimeter is, and then Showdown will tell you everything that it can see, and it'll help you kind of cut through the noise pretty quickly.
Do you have any thoughts on alternatives to Showdown like Census and how they compare?
Yeah, Census is so I don't have as much experience with Census. One of our guys in the group was really, he actually had a guy from Census in there that was helping us. He was using he was able to do searches on our behalf. Census is really good for like web searches and looking for web interfaces. And one of the things that he was doing was, and this is actually how we found a lot of those Exchange servers, was he was able to craft a search query that would detect there was a string in the response from the Exchange server that Census was collecting, and then he was able to cross-reference that against SSL certificate details, because most of these Exchange servers, if they're being run with like Outlook Web Access, the organization will pay for an SSL certificate that has their organization name in it. So he was then able to say, okay, let's look for this string of vulnerable Exchange servers, and then let's look for hospital, medical, healthcare, anything like that. And he was able. That was how we found this massive list of Exchange servers. I've also used Binary Edge. It's a great tool. The only reason I didn't use it as much is I just didn't have sort of God access to it.
Definitely. Yeah, and also the I guess it's always find interesting for, especially for like bug bounty hunters, but anybody who's in an organization that isn't large enough to own large IP blocks, but even I guess probably be relevant with them as well. Well, you'll still have, if you've got satellite offices and they're going to spin up an instance, and they'll get like an EC2 instance or some cloud instance that isn't necessarily within their IP blocks, and then there are some interesting techniques to be able to tie those servers back to the organization to be able to find them. And like you mentioned, SSL is a great one. CRTSH is a great way to try to find some other related IPs. Are there other techniques besides for SSL that you like to use?
Yeah, so you touch on SSL. That is actually one of my favorite things in Showdown, and most of the searches I'm telling you about, I'm trying to make sure that they're all either free or very cheap licenses. You can do SSL certificate searches, and I've used those to search for keywords, right? So you can search for health, hospital, etc. Um, um,
And then you can
Sorry,
do
I
that
forgot
for
the first part
domain
of the
names as
question.
well.
Yeah, you can do that so you can do some level of domain names. There is no specific domain name search inside Showdown, but you could plug in the domain of your company. One of the other techniques that I'll use is there's a website that I like. It's called dnsdumpster.com. It kind of does DNS enumeration for you. So you can sort of hit that and it'll show you all the DNS that it knows about. Now, granted, it's not necessarily comprehensive, but it'll show you what it knows. And then you can actually just pull out IP addresses from there and then start. And that's a good way for finding, like, if they're running in a cloud where, it's going to be Microsoft or it's going to be Amazon or Google. It helps you figure out, okay, this is their specific cloud resources. Showdown also has a kind of cool feature on their command line tool where you can it's just like Showdown domain, and you stick a domain name in and it'll tell you the same, whatever DNS zone information it knows. But you can also use, I think it's the minus capital D flag, where it'll show you not only the A records and all the zone information, but it'll show you what open ports Showdown knows about for each one of those IP addresses. That's I've found really useful. Just kind of either, if it's a small zone, you can just look at it by yourself, or you dump it to a text file and then look for certain ports that you don't want to see, like maybe 3389 for RDP, or I think it's 515 for printers, and you can basically start to figure out, instead of having to download a big JSON file, you'll be able to say, okay, this is a fairly quick way of looking through at least the forward-looking zones of what's exposed.
Yeah, and another technique, if you wanted, there's Rapid7 has those internet wide scans, Sonar project. Yeah, and it's another. I mean, if you got to download the data and parse it, which can take a while, but another great way to find some shadow IT that may be relevant for an in scope engagement.
Yeah, that's a fantastic resource, and I think my understanding is one of the tag searches that is on it requires a more expensive Showdown license. It actually has a tag for self-signed, so any self-signed certificates it finds. So I would use that. I could find printers, phone systems, web administration panels for routers, switches, VPN concentrators. I'm going to take an educated guess that in a Rapid7 data set, you'd be able to say, okay, let me look for any certificate that's self-signed, cross search it against whatever organization or network block that you're looking at, and you may be able to discover, here's, there's an ad, like I said, finding people's printer admin panels on the internet always scares the crap out of me.
Wait, so how does that work in Showdown? You're looking at a network block, and then you're looking at ports, or you're looking at the certificate. You see that it's self signed, And then you're just digging into what's behind the TLS server to see that's a printer?
Yeah, well, so there's a couple ways to do it. I mean, there is it has Showdown makes it easy if you have the enterprise licenses, it gives you the ability to search by these tags. So you just say tag self-signed, and then organization, whatever hospital, it'll show you. It'll take the hospital network, and then it'll show you only the self-signed certificates that it's seen running on that network. Now, with some scripting foo, you can probably get the same thing by just using the download feature. Download all of the results against that network, put it, it'll come down in a JSON file, and then you can actually parse out certificate details from the JSON, but you're going to have to use JQ and maybe some Python scripting to be able to figure out, okay, of these SSL certificates, which are going to be just a certificate blob, you need to parse that out and then pull the fields out to say, hey, is this self-signed or is it actually signed by a valid CA? There is the extra money you pay just makes it easier.
Okay, yeah, it sounds like a cool technique. I should try that sometime. So, how did you get started in InfoSec?
I've been hacking into networks since I was about 12. And then it's always been sort of a hobby of mine. And then I spent most of my career doing network engineering and sort of security on the side. So I would do, I'd work for a couple of large networking companies, and I would not only help them deploy things, but I would give them, my own advice on how to do things securely. I switched over to Microsoft back in 2014. I spent a couple of years on their networking team building out their data center networks. And back in 2016, I decided, you know what, I know a lot about information security. I should do this as a career instead of as a hobby. And that's when I switched over to the Microsoft Security Response Center. I was pushing out security patches for a lot of the high profile vulns between 2016 and 2020. And then late last year, I switched over to a senior researcher role at Defender ATP. I wasn't there as long as I'd like to be or wanted to be because a CTO job came knocking, and I figured it was an opportunity that I couldn't pass by.
Awesome, cool. All right, thanks so much for coming on the show. Where can people learn more about you?
So I'm on Twitter. My handle's N0X08. I use the same handle everywhere. You can find some of my conference talks on YouTube. And then I use the same handle on GitHub, N0X08. I have PDF slides of all the talks that I've done, and I have sort of a little repository of some of the Showdown queries that as I have time, when I figure out a query for a weird device, I'll just stick it up in there. It's not been updated as frequently as I'd like to, but and then I try to be pretty responsive. Feel free to message me or DM me on Twitter. I'd like to give back to the community as much as I can.
Awesome. All right, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, man.
All right, that's it for this week. Thanks again for listening and leaving reviews. If you have any comments or questions, I'd love to hear from you. I'm at Jamoose on Twitter, or drop me an email at podcast@breachsense.io. And if you're part of a security team that needs visibility into your employees, customers, third-party suppliers' breach credentials or data before criminals exploit them, head on over to breachsense.io to apply for a free 7-day trial. Thanks for listening. I'll be back in your earbuds next Thursday morning.